20 mega projects, 20 declarations of defiance, 20 visions that took Africa from the margins of history and placed it at the center of its own destiny. What Ibrahim Traoré built was not just infrastructure. It was a living manifesto that proved Africa could rise, unshaken and unashamed. This was the story of 20 mega projects that changed Africa forever. And within it lies the clearest truth of all. Dignity will always outshine exploitation, and courage will always overcome fear. For every refinery built, every classroom connected, every road paved, a new chapter was written. Not a dependency, but a sovereignty. And now the choice is ours. Will we watch silently as arrogance tries once again to dictate Africa's fate? Or will we stand together, amplifying the stories that prove another future is possible? If you believe dignity must always defeat arrogance, subscribe now. If you believe courage must always rise against fear, share this video. Because Africa's story is not finished. It is still being written, and each share, each voice, each action carries it further. From Ouagadougou to Nairobi, from Dakar to Johannesburg, the rhythm is the same, a continent reborn. And you, yes you, are part of that rhythm when you refuse silence, when you choose to echo these stories of pride, justice, and rebirth. Remember this, movements don't end with a headline. Revolutions don't stop with applause. They live on in the whispers, the chants, the small actions multiplied 1,000,000 times. And so, as the world holds its breath, one question lingers. 20 projects have already lit the fire. The next project may already be underway. When the dust of politics and headlines settles, what remains is not just infrastructure or policy, but the values they carry. Traoré's 20 projects were never about concrete steel or data points alone. They were about something deeper, about dignity, sovereignty, and the courage to stand tall when the world expected you to kneel. For over a century, Africa had been told its destiny must be dictated by others. Its resources were extracted, its leaders pressured, its youth taught to look outward for validation. But in one decisive moment, a young soldier shattered that script. Each refinery, each solar plant, each university network was not just a project. It was a declaration. We are worthy. We are capable. We will define ourselves. The moral was not limited to Burkina Faso or even to Africa. It spoke to every community that has ever been underestimated. Every people told they were too small, too weak, too dependent to rise. It was a reminder that dignity does not come as a gift from the powerful. It is seized, protected, and lived. Traoré's vision reframed sovereignty not as isolation, but as interdependence on equal terms. Nations cooperating, but never submitting. For the youth of Africa, this was more than politics. It was validation. The student logging into a digital classroom, the farmer planting with free fertilizer, the child flicking on a solar-powered light. Each felt themselves part of something greater. They were no longer invisible in the world's story. They were its protagonists. And in their pride, you could see the flicker of a continent rising. Foreign powers had mocked him as a boy soldier, a passing anomaly. Yet history has a way of turning insults into symbols. By holding his ground, Traoré proved that courage is not measured by age, nor sovereignty by size. He showed that a leader does not have to bow before the powerful to be respected. That true respect comes from serving one's people first. The lesson echoes far beyond borders. That arrogance, no matter how loud, can be silenced by dignity. That greed, no matter how entrenched, can be uprooted by courage. And that oppression, no matter how old, can be broken by vision. In this way, Traoré's revolution was not just African. It was universal. And so, his 20 projects became more than achievements. They became torches, lit one by one, until the continent was aglow with possibility. A fire that began in the heart of Burkina Faso now spread through deserts and savannas, across mountains and coasts, carried by the voices of 1.4 billion people. The world may debate his methods, may argue over risks and outcomes, but what cannot be denied is the spark he ignited, a spark that told Africa's youth, you are not waiting for the future, you are building it now. One man's 20 projects lit a fire that 1.4 billion Africans now carry. This is not just a story of Burkina Faso. It's the story of Africa's rebirth, The day the 20th project was announced, the digital world lit up like a wildfire. On TikTok, clips of Traoré's speeches were cut into viral sound bites, remixed with music, overlaid with chants of pride. On Twitter, hashtags exploded across the continent. Hashtag Africa Rising, hashtag Our Gold, Our Future, hashtag Traoré20. Youth from Lagos and Nairobi recorded themselves saying the same line. We are not poor, we were made poorer. Suddenly, his words became the slogans of a generation. In WhatsApp groups and Telegram channels, farmers shared pictures of their new fertilizer deliveries. Students posted selfies with laptops powered by solar lamps. Soldiers trained under the Sahel Pact filmed joint exercises. The ripple effect wasn't abstract. It was visible, tangible, immediate, a young Malian wrote. For the first time, I feel like my country is part of something bigger than borders. A Kenyan student replied, for the first time, I believe Africa is not just geography, it's destiny. Then came the memes. Caricatures of Western politicians sweating over maps of Africa-flooded Instagram. A viral cartoon showed IMF officials holding a leash, only for a young soldier to cut it with one swift stroke. Protest crowds in Ouagadougou chanted, our gold, our hands, our future. The streets echoed like a football stadium after a victory goal. Social media transformed Traoré's projects from policy into legend. Other leaders could not ignore it. In Mali, officials began echoing the call for currency independence. In Niger, plans for new solar farms were fast-tracked. Even in countries once cautious, whispers turned into debates in parliament. If a small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso could defy the old order, why not them? Traoré had not only shifted policies, he had shifted the imagination of an entire continent. But where there was inspiration, there was also fear. In Western capitals, analysts scrambled to predict what would come next. Financial newspapers ran anxious headlines. Is Africa turning away? Diplomats in Brussels and Washington demanded urgent briefings. French media painted Traoré as a radical populist, a dangerous boy playing with fire. Yet their panic only amplified his stature. To young Africans, every insult hurled at him by the West was proof that he was striking the right chords. Journalists descended on Ouagadougou. Some came hoping to expose chaos, others to capture history in the making. They found bustling construction sites, energized youth, and a leader who spoke softly yet with fire in his eyes. International news segments, once dismissive, now carried a tone of awe. Even those critical admitted something was happening that could not be ignored. And so, the 20 projects took on a life of their own. They were no longer just initiatives of a single leader. They became the blueprint of possibility. Every African who saw a refinery rising, a solar plant humming, a student crossing borders with scholarship felt the ownership. These were not just Traoré's projects. They were Africa's projects. By then, the chant had spread beyond Burkina Faso, beyond the Sahel, beyond language and ethnicity. In markets, in classrooms, in parliament chambers, one phrase united millions. Our time has come. But history is not without resistance. And while Africa celebrated, the forces that had long profited from its submission began to sharpen their knives. By now, the world was watching with unease. 15 projects had already shaken the ground beneath foreign corporations, banks, and governments. But what came next was not incremental. It was seismic. The last 5 projects revealed the full scale of Traoré's vision, a masterstroke that would send shockwaves across Africa and beyond. The first was perhaps the boldest, an African payment system designed to end the CFA currency trap. For decades, 14 African countries had their economies chained to a currency printed in Paris, monitored by French banks, and controlled by policies that suffocated growth. Traoré declared enough. His plan was for a digital and physical payment system managed by Africans, for Africans, freeing nations from humiliating dependence on a colonial relic. Western bankers erupted in outrage. The IMF issued stern warnings, calling it financial instability. French officials flew in, desperate to dissuade him. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, in markets from Dakar to Niamey, people whispered a new word with pride: freedom. Next came the Continental University Network. Traoré understood that sovereignty meant more than borders. It meant minds unshackled. His plan linked universities across Africa into a single knowledge alliance, pooling research, sharing professors, and creating scholarships so a young Burkinabe could study in Ghana, a Malian in Kenya, a Congolese in Morocco. Western media dismissed it as unrealistic, claiming African institutions lacked standards. But when the first cohort of students crossed borders under the program, carrying laptops and dreams, the continent saw something greater than education. They saw a generation rising as one. Then, the project that rattled defense ministries worldwide, military technology research centers. For centuries, Africa's wars have been fought with weapons designed elsewhere, its armies relying on imports and hand-me-downs. Traoré wanted that era to end. He announced centers dedicated to African-designed drones, armored vehicles, and defense systems. Critics howled that it would fuel conflict, but Traoré countered with a single truth. Dependence is the greatest insecurity of all. When the first prototypes rolled out, the symbolism was undeniable. For the first time in modern history, Africa was building its own shield. But Traoré did not stop at the battlefield. He looked to the skies and the sun, unveiling a renewable energy megagrid. This was not just about solar panels or wind farms. It was about linking them across borders into a continental web of clean power, ensuring that energy shortages would no longer cripple development. Oil giants saw it as betrayal. Lobbyists whispered of sabotage. Yet villagers in rural Burkina Faso, who for the first time lit their homes with reliable, clean electricity, celebrated not just light, but liberation. Each megawatt generated by the megagrid was a blow against the fossil fuel stranglehold of foreign companies. And then the finale, the crown jewel of his 20-project revolution, the African Trade Highway Initiative. Roads and railways had already begun stitching nations together. But this was different. This was a superhighway designed to span countries, linking ports to capitals, capitals to hinterlands, trade routes that bypassed colonial choke points. It was a physical embodiment of Pan-Africanism, an artery for commerce, culture, and unity. Western contractors fought for control, but Traoré ensured it remained in African hands. Farmers envisioned their crops traveling across borders with ease. Traders saw endless markets ahead, and ordinary Africans saw what generations had been denied. A continent connected not by foreign design, but by African will. The reaction was immediate. The IMF convened emergency meetings, issuing dire forecasts. Western ambassadors scrambled to capitals, delivering ultimatums in polished tones. Sanctions were whispered, pressure mounted. Editorials in Paris and London painted Traoré as reckless, dangerous, destabilizing. But beneath the storm of condemnation, something irreversible had already begun. Markets from Dakar to Dar es Salaam buzzed with hope. Leaders once hesitant now began to imitate. And across Africa, from city streets to dusty villages, people repeated the same phrase. This is the Africa we were told we could never have. By the 20th project, it was clear this was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about a continental awakening, one that no sanction, no warning, no lecture could silence. And while Western powers panicked, nothing could stop the shockwaves spreading across Africa. If the first wave was thunder, the second was lightning. Traoré had proven he could shock the world, but now he set out to reshape it. His next 10 projects would not simply challenge the status quo. They would tilt the very balance of power. The announcement of Pan-African railway lines sent ripples across the continent. For generations, colonial borders had sliced Africa into fragments, with railroads designed to move raw resources to ports, not to connect Africans to one another. Traoré's vision was the opposite. Trains that ran from Burkina to Mali, from Niger to Ghana, stitching together lands that foreign empires had once divided. Western companies bid to control the contracts, hoping to hijack the plan, but Traoré stunned them by awarding construction to African firms. Farmers saw new markets opening, workers saw jobs sprouting, and traders envisioned a continent connected by steel, not by chains. Next, he turned to the earth beneath their feet. State-owned mining companies were declared the new custodians of Africa's treasure. No longer would foreign corporations waltz in with contracts written in French boardrooms. Critics cried foul, investors threatened to flee, and headlines predicted collapse. But Traoré was unmoved. He rallied geologists, engineers, and local workers to reclaim the mines. The first shipments of gold, manganese, and zinc under Burkinabe ownership sent a shockwave through markets. For the people, it was proof that their land finally served them, not distant shareholders. Then came water, the lifeline of Africa's soil. Traoré launched agricultural megadams, colossal projects to capture rivers that for centuries have flowed wastefully into the sea. Elites argued the cost was too high. Foreign advisors warned of environmental concerns. Yet the people knew the truth. Without water, there was no future. When the first dam gates closed, thousands of hectares of farmland bloomed. Villages once at the mercy of drought began to thrive. For every farmer who now tilled fertile ground, Traoré became more than president. He became a guardian of life itself. But he was not content with infrastructure alone. He turned inward, insisting that Africa's future could not be imported. With the launch of indigenous technology programs, he poured funding into universities and local labs. Western pundits mocked the idea, saying Burkina Faso could never compete in science. But within months, students were designing software, engineers were creating medical devices, and innovators were solving African problems with African minds. For the youth, it was a revelation. They did not have to wait for technology to trickle down from Silicon Valley. They could build their own. And then, the move that rattled defense ministries from Paris to Washington, local arms factories. For decades, African armies have fought with weapons bought at inflated prices from abroad, always dependent, always waiting. Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would manufacture its own. Opposition was fierce. Foreign governments warned of instability. Embargoes loomed, and critics called it reckless. But when the first rifles rolled off assembly lines, crafted by African hands for African defense, the symbolism was undeniable. No longer beggars in their own wars, the soldiers stood straighter, prouder. Traoré's vision extended to the human body itself. He announced the expansion of free healthcare clinics, determined to break the cycle where families sold land just to buy medicine. Pharmaceutical giants lobbied against him, fearing the rise of local generic drugs. Yet clinics began appearing in dusty towns and remote villages, places long forgotten by both government and aid agencies. Mothers carrying children across miles of savannah no longer found closed doors. They found doctors, medicine, and dignity. Next came water purification plants, designed to end the silent killer of dirty drinking water. For decades, diseases spread through rivers and wells, while international NGOs handed out temporary fixes. Traoré aimed higher. He invested in modern purification technology, building plants that turned muddy rivers into clean lifelines. Critics scoff at the cost, but every glass of clear water in a child's hand silenced them. It was not charity. It was sovereignty over survival itself. And then the roads. Africa's interior had long been trapped by isolation, with rural villages cut off from opportunity. Traoré's rural road networks project promised asphalt, where once there was only dust. Contractors tied to old regimes tried to sabotage the bids, but Traoré brought in young engineers and soldiers to build with speed and pride. Roads linked farmers to cities, students to schools, and markets to markets. Suddenly, the nation felt smaller, connected, alive. But Traoré's revolution was not just material. It was spiritual, rooted in dignity. He launched affordable housing complexes, sweeping new neighborhoods for families who had lived for decades in crumbling shacks. Foreign investors sneered, claiming the state could never manage it. Yet soon, workers moved into sturdy homes with electricity, plumbing, and pride. A father could lock his door without fear of rain leaking through the roof. A child could study beneath a working light. These were not just houses. They were proof that the poor were worthy of comfort, not just survival. Finally, he struck at one of the most insidious colonial relics, the control of narrative. He announced state-funded media outlets, a network dedicated to broadcasting African voices instead of foreign propaganda. For years, the continent's image had been filtered through Western lenses: poverty porn, instability, caricatures. Now, African journalists told African stories. Foreign powers fumed, accusing Traoré of propaganda. But the truth was clear. Africans were finally seeing themselves through their own eyes. The silence of dependency was broken. Each project deepened the revolution. Each one faced resistance, by elites, by corporations, by governments who saw their grip slipping. But with every completed milestone, the people grew bolder, the vision clearer. By the time he reached Project 15, the world realized this was not just a president. This was a revolution. The world expected modest reforms, a few symbolic gestures to buy time. Instead, Traoré struck fast and struck deep. His first announcement was a thunderclap. Burkina Faso would build a national gold refinery. For decades, the nation's gold had been extracted by foreign companies, shipped to Europe, and refined abroad, leaving Burkina with scraps while others counted billions. But Traoré declared that the refining would now happen on Burkinabe soil. Overnight, the chain was broken. The move was defiance wrapped in steel, ending the ritual of sending Africa's wealth away for validation. Elites howled, corporations panicked, but ordinary people cheered. For the first time, they could point to their own soil and say, "Our gold, our future." No sooner had the dust settled than he unveiled his second strike, the creation of a new African military alliance, the Sahel Security Pact. Tired of foreign troops dictating terms on African soil, Traoré invited neighboring nations to form a united defense front. It was audacious, a declaration that Africans could defend themselves without NATO or Paris pulling the strings. Critics dismissed it as impossible. Some foreign analysts sneered that it was childish bravado. Yet within weeks, soldiers across borders began training together, strategizing as equals. For young Africans who had grown up watching their lands patrolled by outsiders, this was more than a military pact. It was dignity in uniform. His third project struck at the belly of the nation, agriculture. Traoré announced a free fertilizer program, ensuring farmers would not be hostage to foreign companies selling overpriced chemicals. To many, fertilizer seemed mundane, hardly a weapon of revolution. But in a land where hunger had long been used as leverage, it was a seismic shift. Suddenly, farmers, those who had fed nations but lived in poverty, had the means to plant, to harvest, to thrive. The elites who imported food frowned. Their control slipped away. And the peasants, long ignored, saw a leader who finally valued their hands and their soil. Then came energy. Traoré unveiled plans for new solar plants, massive projects designed to capture Sahel's relentless sun and turn it into power. For decades, Burkina Faso's villages had gone dark at night, waiting for electricity grids that never reached them, while uranium mined nearby lit up European cities. Traoré's solar plants promised a reversal. Africa's sun would now power African homes. The symbolism was undeniable. Every solar panel erected was another blow against dependency, another reminder that the continent's natural abundance was meant for its own people first. Finally, he turned to the minds of the youth. He launched digital education platforms, bringing online courses, virtual classrooms, and modern tools to schools across the country. In a nation where chalkboards were cracked and textbooks outdated, this was nothing less than revolutionary. For young people hungry to learn, it was like a window opening to the world. But it was also strategic, because Traoré knew that sovereignty could not survive if the next generation remained trapped in ignorance. Knowledge, after all, was the sharpest weapon against oppression. Each project landed like a drumbeat, each one bolder than the last. A refinery to reclaim wealth, an alliance to reclaim security, fertilizer to reclaim food, solar plants to reclaim energy, digital platforms to reclaim knowledge. Together, they formed a rhythm too loud to ignore. Foreign powers muttered. Elites grew uneasy. Commentators warned that he was moving too fast, too boldly, that such defiance would bring consequences. But for the people, it was electrifying. They had been told for decades that change was impossible, that Africa must accept its place. Now they watch a young man in fatigues rewrite the rules with every announcement. And yet, as stunning as these 5 projects were, they were only the beginning. The storm was just gathering. The world had not yet seen the full force of Traoré's vision. But these were only the beginning. Ibrahim Traoré's story does not begin in marble palaces or gilded halls. It begins in the red earth of Burkina Faso, in a modest village where dreams were larger than means and survival often depended on resilience. He was not born into wealth, nor into political dynasties that shielded their children from hardship. He was born into soil of a nation still scarred by poverty, hunger, and the endless shadow of foreign control. As a boy, Traoré was quiet, observant, a listener in a land where noise often drowned truth. He walked the same dusty paths as his neighbors, drank from the same wells, and watched his family work tirelessly against the weight of scarcity. Like countless African children, he saw firsthand what it meant to live in a land rich with gold, yet filled with hunger, a land with uranium that lit foreign cities while his own village waited for power lines that never came. These contradictions etched themselves into him. They were not lessons from books but from life, and they forged a determination stronger than any weapon. When he entered military school, he was not the strongest, not the wealthiest, but he was relentless. His uniform was not polished by privilege, but by sweat. Training was grueling, but Traoré carried within him something many lacked, a clarity of purpose. He was not there for personal ambition. He was there because he believed service was the only path left for someone like him. In the barracks, he became known not for arrogance, but for endurance. He would read late into the night, while others slept, poring over history, studying the strategies of revolutionaries, the mistakes of fallen leaders, the betrayals that haunted Africa's past. Thomas Sankara's speeches became his compass. Sankara, the charismatic leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, had spoken of dignity, women's rights, and breaking the chains of foreign domination. Though Sankara was assassinated before Traoré was even born, his words lived on, whispering in the hearts of a new generation. Traoré read them under dim light, repeating them to himself like prayers. He studied not only Sankara, but Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, leaders who stood against impossible odds. Each page reminded him that greatness was not about wealth or connections. It was about vision and sacrifice. But books alone do not prepare a man for betrayal, and the military taught him that lesson as well. He saw officers more loyal to foreign advisors than to their own people. He witnessed resources diverted, soldiers disillusioned, and leaders who wore uniforms but bowed their heads in weakness. It would have been easy to fall into despair, to tell himself that change was impossible. Yet Traoré never surrendered to cynicism. His youth, often mocked as inexperience, was a shield against resignation. He believed with the stubbornness of the young that dignity was worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed unwinnable. His rise to the ranks was not meteoric, but steady. He earned trust not through empty promises, but by standing shoulder to shoulder with those under his command. Soldiers who felt invisible saw in him a commander who listened, who shared their rations, who spoke to them as brothers, not subordinates. He became a leader not by decree, but by respect. In a world where many leaders were feared, Traoré was respected, and that difference mattered. Beyond the barracks, he became a quiet voice of resistance. In speeches to his peers, he spoke of sovereignty not as a slogan, but as survival. He argued that a nation cannot call itself free if it must beg for bread while its land produces gold. He said sovereignty was not abstract. It was water to drink, schools to attend, electricity in the villages. He told anyone who would listen that Africa did not lack resources. It lacked courage and leadership. His words, carried from one soldier to another, grew into whispers of something new, a leader not molded by corruption, but by conviction. Still, his journey was filled with struggle. He had no vast wealth to shield him from hardship. He was younger than most of his rivals, dismissed often for what they called his inexperience. He faced skepticism, ridicule, and a heavy hand of entrenched elites who saw him as an outsider. But every obstacle only deepened his resolve. Every doubt pushed him closer to action. And when the moment came, when his nation stood on the edge of collapse, when foreign meddling deepened divisions, when corruption threatened to swallow Burkina Faso whole, Traoré did not hesitate. He stepped forward, not with the polish of politicians, but with the raw authority of someone who had lived the very pain his people endured. His youth became his weapon. His lack of wealth became his shield. His humility became his strength. In that moment, he was no longer just a soldier. He became a revolutionary leader, a man who had carried the lessons of history into the present, determined not to repeat Africa's tragedies, but to carve a new destiny. He was not perfect, but he was unshakable. This is why, when he unveiled his first mega project, the world gasped. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré's rise is seismic, you must first confront the scars of Africa's past. Scars carved not by time but by deliberate hands. For centuries, Africa was not seen as a continent of nations, but as a treasure chest for foreign empires. Gold was stripped from its rivers, uranium gouged from its earth, cocoa harvested from its farms, and men and women stolen from their homes to labor in lands not their own. Colonizers drew borders with rulers on maps, slicing through kingdoms, families, and tribes, leaving behind artificial states designed to serve outside interests rather than their own people. When so-called independence arrived, it was independence in name only. The French left, but the CFA franc remained, a colonial currency that kept 14 nations chained to Paris. The mines of uranium in Niger powered French lights, while African children studied by candlelight. The gold refineries sat in Europe, while Burkina Faso soil was gutted and its people left in poverty. To the west, Africa was not partner but provider, not sovereign but subordinate. And every time Africa dared to rise, the invisible hand of foreign interference pulled it back down. This is the villain Traoré was born to face. Not a single man, not a single government, but a vast system, a web of corporations, politicians, bankers, and local elites working together to keep Africa exploitable. Western companies wrote contracts that gave them 90% of mining profits, while leaving locals with poisoned water. African presidents signed deals that kept them in palaces while their citizens died in silence. And international lenders preached austerity, even as they drowned nations in unpayable debt. But arrogance has a way of blinding the powerful. When Traoré appeared on the scene, they did not see a threat. They saw a joke. Western journalists smirked, writing headlines that called him a boy soldier. Television anchors raised their eyebrows, suggesting he was nothing more than a placeholder in Burkina Faso's endless carousel of coups. Diplomats whispered that he lacked the education, the pedigree, the experience to last more than a few months. He was mocked in op-eds as a temporary figure, a hot-headed youth soon to be swept aside by the real players of geopolitics. And yet, the more they ridiculed him, the quieter he became. While foreign powers waited for him to stumble, he said little, choosing instead to listen. While elites expected him to lash out, he studied. While critics laughed at his lack of polish, he built alliances, not in glossy offices, but in the dusty streets where his people gathered. His silence was not weakness, it was calculation. That silence unsettled those who thought themselves masters of the game, because arrogance thrives on noise. It expects defiance to come loudly, rashly, in ways that can be crushed. But Traoré's defiance was patient. It was methodical, and it was growing. The system that underestimated him had done the same before. They had underestimated Thomas Sankara, the visionary who once told the United Nations that Africa would no longer pay illegitimate debts. They had underestimated Patrice Lumumba, who spoke of dignity before being silenced by bullets. They had underestimated Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in a cell only to walk out stronger than ever. Every time, arrogance laughed first and trembled later. What they missed in Traoré was not his youth, but his resolve. He was forged by the very failures that arrogance created. The hunger in villages while gold left the soil, the endless debts while billions were made abroad, the humiliation of leaders bowing for aid while resources flowed outward. Unlike the polished elites who made peace with this order, Traoré carried the anger of his generation and the memory of Africa's wounds. So while Western media mocked, while politicians dismissed, while corporations carried on extracting, something unseen was taking shape. In hushed meetings with advisors, in conversations with farmers, in late nights of planning, Traoré began sketching not just speeches but blueprints, because he understood that power is not won by words alone. It is cemented in projects, visible, tangible, undeniable. If Africa was to stand tall, it would need dams that could not be ignored, railways that could not be dismissed, and refineries that could not be hidden. And so, while the villains of arrogance celebrated their supposed victory, Traoré's silence was not surrender, it was preparation. For beneath that silence, beneath that calm exterior, he was laying the foundation of something greater than speeches, greater than headlines, greater even than his critics could imagine. And while they laughed, Traoré was laying the foundation of 20 mega projects. Ibrahim Traoré matters because he is not just a leader, He is the youngest head of state in Africa, a soldier barely in his mid-30s who dared to break a century-old pattern of submission. In a continent where the faces of power are often aged, cautious, and compromised, Traoré stands out like a spark in dry grass. He speaks not in the language of diplomacy, but in the rhythm of conviction. He does not bow to protocol, nor does he play the endless chess game of begging foreign aid while surrendering sovereignty. Instead, he speaks of Africa as if it already belongs to its people, and to millions of young Africans watching, that is more radical than any speech a Western leader could deliver. He is an anti-colonial voice in an age where colonialism pretends it no longer exists. Where others talk about partnership, he talks about exploitation. Where others speak of cooperation, he names dependency for what it is, a leash disguised as a handshake. That honesty terrifies those who profit from Africa's silence. His presence alone is a reminder that history is not finished, that Africans are not destined to forever remain suppliers of raw materials and consumers of foreign dreams. But every hero needs a villain, and Traoré has many. In the shadows stand the foreign powers who once carved Africa like meat at banquet, and who still hold its wealth in hidden chains. Exploitative corporations control gold, uranium, oil, and cotton, extracting billions while children in the villages surrounding the mines struggle to eat. International institutions, dressed in the language of development, impose debt traps and dictate policies that keep African nations dependent. And within the continent itself lurk corrupt elites, men who grow rich by selling their people's futures to the highest bidder. For them, Traoré is not a leader to be tolerated. He is a threat to be contained. Every project he dreams is a direct strike against their power. A dam is not just concrete and water. It is freedom from begging for electricity. A refinery is not just industry. It is the end of shipping gold bars to Paris and importing them back as overpriced jewelry. A school is not just bricks and chalkboards. It is a weapon against ignorance, a shield against manipulation. To the people, these projects are survival. To the oppressors, they are rebellion. That is why the stakes are so high. Each project he unveils is more than a plan on paper. It is a declaration of war against the idea that Africa should remain weak, divided, and exploitable. Every announcement he makes sends tremors through boardrooms in Paris, Washington, and London, and through the lavish halls of African elites who have long lived as middlemen for foreign interests. The world underestimates him because of his youth, but it is precisely his youth that fuels him. He belongs to the generation that grew up watching promises broken, resources stolen, and futures dimmed. His defiance is not theoretical, it is personal, and that makes him dangerous. So when Traoré began to unveil his vision, people expected modest reforms, perhaps symbolic gestures. They thought he might shuffle ministers or launch small projects to buy time. But what he revealed instead was not modest, it was monumental. It was nothing less than a blueprint to redraw the destiny of Africa itself. 20 mega projects, each one a blow to the old order, each one a step toward sovereignty, each one a gamble that could cost him everything. And the very first was so audacious, so unthinkable, that it would change the map itself. For over a century, Africa's destiny was written by others until a 35-year-old soldier tore the script apart. His name was Ibrahim Traoré. The world called him too young, too reckless, too unprepared. But in the heart of Burkina Faso, a nation exhausted by coups, crushed by corruption, and suffocated under foreign hands, he stepped forward, not as a polished politician, but as a man with nothing to lose and everything to protect. The scene was chaos. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Whispers of betrayal swirled in every corner, and foreign envoys watched like hawks, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. Western headlines mocked him, calling him a boy soldier and a temporary accident of history. Yet inside the chambers of power, something different was happening. Traoré's eyes were steady, his voice unshaken. He knew what the world did not, that Africa's rebirth would not come politely. It would come like thunder. In his very first address, he did not bow, he did not beg. He spoke of sovereignty, of dignity, of an Africa tired of being dictated to. His words were not the cautious language of diplomacy. They were fire, and that fire spread quickly among the youth who had long been ignored. Streets once filled with despair, now echoed with chants of pride. For the first time in decades, the people felt that power was not drifting further away. It was coming back home, but the risks were deadly. Traoré's rise was a direct challenge to empires, corporations, and entrenched elites who had grown fat on Africa's wounds. To them, he was dangerous, not because he carried weapons, but because he carried vision. They expected him to stumble, to be swallowed by the same traps that had destroyed countless African leaders before him. Yet, what he did next shocked even his allies. Because instead of settling into the comfort of the presidential palace, instead of playing the same tired political games, he unveiled something no one thought possible. A storm of projects so bold, so sweeping, that they would shake Africa's future to its core. And the first of those projects would leave the world gasping. What he did first stunned even his allies.